Morning everybody, Liam Bailey here from O'Brien Palmer. Was recently approached by John, who's a director of one of the companies that we'd wound up. John had been operating a business in the IT space for a number of years. However, due to changing economic circumstances, his business model had also changed. John was faced with the difficulty of confronting his business, confronting its future prospects, and making the difficult decision to wind the company up. As a part of that journey, John went through a lot himself. And as the journey came to a close and the winding up was coming to fruition, John approached me to say that he wanted to tell his story so that people who had been through a similar journey could hear what he had to say and hopefully not necessarily go through some of the negative issues that he'd had to face. We're really blessed and lucky that John would take the time to sit down with us today and tell his story. There's a lot that we can learn from it. Businesses fail for lots and lots of reasons. It doesn't mean anything about you as an individual. I think that we can learn a lot from John, who's come through this journey and come to a happier place, and we're really blessed and lucky that John has agreed to share that with us today. Have a listen to what John's got to say. I'm sure you'll find it really interesting.
Well, my name is John Debrincat. I started a company called eCorner back in 2004, and unfortunately that company had to go into liquidation in 2021. So we're here today. We've talked through a story about how that all happened and where we got to and what we did as a result. And O'Brien Palmer have helped in that process as professional liquidators. So the story will be just how the world unfolded for eCorner over a period of almost 19 years, I guess. So it was very difficult when we realised that we would have to look at options as to eCorner's viability as we went through the last couple of years of the company's life. And as part of that process, we connected up with a company called Groves and Partners, who were financial advisors, and they gave us a number of options. And of course, one option was that maybe we should consider liquidating the business. So over a period of 2 or so years, almost 3 years, we worked through changes to the business in terms of its structure, what was being done internally within the organisation, how we could cut costs, how we could improve productivity. But at a point in 2021, early 2021, we asked Groves and Partners what they should do, or what we should do, and what they advised. And they connected us with Liam from O'Brien Palmer, who are an organisation that specialises in liquidations and business advice. And they took us through the options as to what we might do in terms of if it came to that point, liquidating the business. So in the initial meeting, really it was a get-to-know-you meeting that took place in their offices. We had a really good understanding through that meeting of what the options would be, how the time frame would work, what would happen, how the various stakeholders in the company, the shareholders, the employees, the customers, and the suppliers would all be handled, and what we would have to do with them and for them. And we really ended up with a roadmap that was identified the last point in time when we had to make a decision to liquidate, or we had to make a decision that we would continue the business in some other way. So how did we get to that point with eCorner that liquidation was even on the table as an option? It goes back really in time, and after we started the company in 2004, we were one of the first e-commerce service providers that started in Australia. And by e-commerce service provider, what I'm really saying is an organisation that built online stores and managed and hosted those online stores for the merchants that own the business. And during that early part of eCorner's life, we grew rapidly, very rapidly over a period of almost 10 years, before really we saw any major competition in the marketplace. But from around 2000, 2014, we started to see other organisations internationally and locally begin to develop in that marketplace, and that put more and more pressure onto our organisation in terms of expansion and finding new markets, and that led us to a point where we were approached by Telstra. And the word Telstra can be frightening to many people, and was to us at the time. But when they came to us and asked if we wanted to sell part of the company, we decided that was a great idea. So we went through a year of negotiations with them and came up with an equitable proposal. But in the end, all the shareholders of the company that were advised determined that we wouldn't go down that path. So we actually terminated that discussion, and Telstra walked away from the business. But it gave us an idea to raise capital and then expand the business, which we did. And we took on some very large projects through 2015, 16, 17. We built marketplaces for telecom in New Zealand. We built online stores for some of the largest retailers in Australia, and the kind of the core of our business was always supporting small and medium-sized businesses, and at one stage we had over 3,000 small and medium-sized businesses running online stores through our systems. We also worked with a German company to provide the core technology, which we then modified for our own use, and that technology was great, but it was starting to get quite old and not keeping up with the time. So in 2017, or around 2017, we looked at what we might do to improve the technology, but we also saw how our market was being attacked by organisations that were really coming in with much bigger purses than we had, and were really putting a lot of effort into marketing into our marketplace. At that stage, we were working in every state in Australia, New Zealand. We had businesses over in the United States, in Europe, in Asia, and it was all going very well. And in around 2018, we saw companies like Shopify start up. Shopify, BigCommerce, these were all well-known names that started in the US, but they grew very, very quickly because they had a large marketing base than eCorner had. So eCorner's marketing base effectively was just Australia and New Zealand, although we had expanded a little outside of Australia and New Zealand, but our specialty area was right here at home. And so we were starting to see the issues that would come about. So we decided to keep going with the business at that point in time. That's the first time around 2018 we took some professional advice, where we originally met the people from Groves and Partners, and we plotted out a way of reorganising the business, changing the way the shareholding was working, managing some of the changes to technology by working with our suppliers to reduce costs, and improve what we were offering to our customer base. All that took money, and so we financed it by shareholder loans, and the shareholders created a fund of money which kept the company. We paid out all the company debts that we had at the time, and then refinanced the company through those shareholder loans. But we set those loans up with a security for the shareholders. So in the event that something went terribly wrong, the shareholders would have first call on the whatever cash might be available. In 2019-20, we were actually starting to go back in the right direction, and when we were giving some of these large competitors, such as Shopify, who had then at that point I think gone public, and they were boasting hundreds of thousands, even millions of online stores and customers around the world. But we were working to compete with them in Australia and compete quite well. But then, I think we all forget about 2020, but COVID hit. And in the early part of 2020, we have to make the decision to close down our offices and to send everyone home to work from home. So working from home for most businesses was a struggle. But for an IT business that had projects that had to be delivered against certain timeframes and budgets, it was more than a struggle. So our development staff were then located all in Australia. That was one of our principles, that we only have support and technology people based in Australia. And they were, of course, all remote. So they were working out of home. They were all across the suburbs of Sydney and even interstate in Melbourne and Brisbane. And getting those people to work on projects and continue to be productive became more and more of a struggle. Not because they're not good people, but technology teams, and certainly in 2020 as we were going through this, we had little experience of running this kind of remote environment. And even the technology, like Zoom and some of the things that helped, and Slack and whatever, they were really only starting to come into their own environment in 2020 and hadn't really matured in some cases. And so we saw projects slip behind. We saw the larger competitors like I say, Shopify, BigCommerce, start to eat into our marketplace. It became a much more aggressive marketplace during that period of time. E-commerce, in some instances, went through the roof for businesses. We had some customers whose turnover increased by 200 or 300% between 2019 and 2020. That was very difficult, because what a lot of people don't understand is by increasing the revenue in those online businesses 200 or 300%, you also increase the resources that is used to run those businesses by 200, 300%. And so when all those customers combined were starting to grow rapidly, it started to push at the edge of our resources, which meant we had to then invest in increasing and improving the resources. And with the help of our suppliers, we did. Along with that came much more strict cybersecurity issues and rules. Part of the underlying concept for selling online is being able to take payments by credit card, for example. And behind those credit card payments, there is a concept called PCI DSS, Payment Card Industry Data Security Standards. So these are the underpinning core security processes that must be in place by any organisation that hosts payments, such as we did. The cost of running those security processes went from being tens of thousands to being hundreds of thousands of dollars. And that all happened again over that same period when COVID was hitting. It was like a tsunami of issues that came along. So we decided at that point that we really need to put a plan in place that had a number of options, and that is what we did with the help of Brian Palmer. So part of that meeting in early 2021, again, it was in the middle of COVID. It was a very funny meeting. It was all COVID distant. We were face to face, but a lot of the mask wearing and all the rest of it was still there. And we met for the first time and mapped out 3 courses of action. One course of action was to work the business back into the black, if you like, although we weren't technically in the red at that point in time. Second option was to find an organisation that would buy or invest in the business. and the third option was to liquidate the business. And we decided to follow the last two options. So Groves and Partners were given a project to go look for potential investors and buyers, and Brian Palmer were given a project of mapping out the liquidation, or in the event that we find a buyer, of course we would still have to liquidate what was left of the company after the buyer had bought what they want. So that's the point at which, we had an idea of what we had to do, and then we just had to understand how to make those things work, which was probably the more difficult process. So once we knew that we were going to liquidate the company, which occurred around about April 2021, we came back to O'Brien Palmer and sat down with them to discuss the process and also get the documentation in place. So the one thing about liquidating a business is there is a very specific set of processes that have to be followed. And there is a very specific and sometimes complex set of documents that have to be completed, and the owners of the business are the ones that have to complete those documents with the assistance of their advisors. So the good part about where we were at that point in time, if there can be a good part, is for our whole business life we had used the same accounting firm, which was Presidio Partners. They had been great in keeping us on track with things like superannuation and BAS and the ATO payments and all those things that a lot of people start to defer when times get tough in an organisation. So we had a good handle on where we were financially with the business, and we had all the documentation we'd ever need was available through Presidio and Partners. Groves and Partners had now been working with us for a little while, so they understood our business and where we were. And of course we had O'Brien Palmer and the core person there that we met with and who looked after us during this process was Liam. So Liam, number one, was great because he knew the people at Groves and Partners. He also knew the people at Presidio, which was very lucky in our respect. So we hadn't put those two pieces together at that point in time, but we found out that they did. They all knew each other. The one thing we found that we needed was to get legal advice, and then of course it can't be from any of the people we already are working with. And so we were very lucky to find JHK Legal. And they're specialty lawyers in business issues like liquidation. So the legal side of things, we had great advice, and I would tell anyone going through this process to get that in place first. Get someone who can advise you, who is not part of your accounting team or a business advisory team or liquidation organisation, but get some person who is a qualified legal advisor and lawyer into your personal cycle, so that you can really know you're getting good and correct advice. The next step in terms of the process was we had to sign off on the actual company being put into liquidation. And the day we did that, we knew that all the responsibility for then running the company is lost by the directors. Though the directors of the business no longer, once you sign off that liquidation process, the directors of the business no longer have any management control over the business in any way, shape or form. And there are also certain privacy principles that you need to comply with in terms of how you talk about the business at that point in time. So from an internal point of view with the staff, we had to go through some processes with them, and I'll come back to that. From a customer point of view, we couldn't really tell the customers we were going into liquidation because until that process is underway, you can't really do anything to impact the day-to-day business of the company. And so in some ways it looked like business as usual from an eCorner point of view, but of course it wasn't. So the processes that you have to go through are all very specific, and they're well documented. I don't think many business owners, whether they be small or large business owners, who have not been through a liquidation before would understand just how structured the process is. And of course, there are good parts and bad parts to having a structured process. The bad part is that you can't deviate from where you're going. But the good part is that everything gets covered. You know, you can't really do step 2 until you finish step A. And you know, there are some processes and some documentation that you have to complete, which require quite a bit of time to do. And they can be very onerous if you don't have the documentation. You know, you don't have your own business data at hand and easily accessible. But once you go through those documents, as you're going through one step at a time, you find that it's getting, the process is actually getting easier and easier. So in terms of the start of all that, once we signed off that letter, we had to make some deposit money. We had to deposit some money to cover the cost of the liquidation, and there is a cost to the liquidation. You know, it's not a free process. Firstly, when O'Brien Palmer took over the process, the liquidation commenced, then they went through another off period where they were looking for potential buyers of the business. And we did identify a number of possible buyers. So the shareholders of the company were closely involved in that process, but O'Brien Palmer were the people that were driving it, and they used Grovers and Partners to actually do the sales offering, advertise that information, and then follow up on potential leads. So we found there were companies that wanted to buy parts of the business, and there were some companies that were looking to acquire the whole business. Often it meant that there was a personal obligation, so they would actually say they would acquire this business, but only if certain individuals, the management of the business that was there at the time, would continue working with the business. And that's not always something you can get an agreement on. So some employees may not be comfortable with continuing on in working for a business that's gone on to be owned by someone else, and we had to go through those processes. At the end of the day, all the assets of the business have to be sold off or terminated. So in that first period of time after we signed off on the liquidation, then O'Brien Palmer prepared documents to send out to all suppliers, to send out to all employees, and to send out to all the customers to notify them that the business is now in liquidation. It's under the management of O'Brien Palmer, and that we're working towards a process of terminating the business or turning it around in some way. That's good because during that period of time, the business does have a lot of potential options it can take that the owners prior to liquidation didn't have. So it does seem like a fairly scary process. I mean, there are some nights where you wake up and you think, am I doing the right thing? But at the end of the day, in Australia, there are millions of businesses that have gone into liquidation, and not all of them have bad stories. Right? Not all of them have negative issues. The next steps were the most difficult, and that is to sit down with the shareholders and tell them that the business was going to be terminated, and to sit down with the employees and explain to them that some of them would be made redundant in the business immediately and paid out, and they would be gone. where one or two employees who were key to maintaining the operation for the existing customers were essential in keeping the business together to offer off as a sale. So those employees had to agree that they would continue working while the business was going through this process, which for them was a very difficult decision. But luckily we had some good people who'd been with us for a long time, and they did help through that process. We found out also, of course, that there are issues like long service leave and annual leave that accrue when you're running a small business. Not everyone takes 15 days holiday every year or 10 days holiday every year. So we found that some people who had been with the business for almost 18 years, that life of the business, had accrued very large annual leave accrual and also long service leave accruals. But we also, part of the process, we found out about a system called FEG, which is a government-run system which actually enabled the government to pay out some of those accrued service leave, long service leave and annual leave and so on, debts to employees, so the employee didn't come out badly. And that's open to small businesses where the financials just don't work out well enough to pay out all those personal issues. So the key things like superannuation, tax and so on, we were all up to date. So there were no major issues there. We had a lot of debts that accrued to us from customers. We had very few debts accruing to our suppliers, and so the job of actually financially doing that work, although it was up to Brian Palmer, we did help in terms of communication with customers and a number of other things. I think the whole thing to learn here is that the liquidators are not actually your enemy. And I guess when we first started to talk about liquidation, in my mind that did come up. These guys are not going to be our friends. But the reality is they're not your friends and they're not your enemies. They are, a professional organisation that is in place and is accredited to help businesses wrap themselves up, whether that's because they can't afford to go on anymore or just because the business has stopped trading, right? And so their processes are very straightforward, and they're very good at what they do. So the end of the day, having that relationship, having that organisation there is very good. Now, because we went into, we liquidated the business ourselves, so we didn't have some company, some supplier come in where they claim a lot of money and force on a liquidation. We had much more control over the process. And so the thing to learn from that is don't let it get to the point where you owe so much money that you can't control that liquidation process. Be realistic in your outlook in terms of what your company or what a company is going to do. We were very, very lucky to get good advice all the way through the process, and we were very realistic. And rather than accruing further debts to the ATO and suppliers and whoever it might be, to the point where we couldn't make that decision ourselves, we were in control of the process at some point. So being able to determine when that happened and on your, as best as possible on your own terms takes a lot of pain away from going through a business liquidation. So in 2021, around about July, we signed off on the liquidation letter. The business got turned over, if you like, to Brian Palmer. For about another 3-4 months after that, we negotiated with some organisations who were interested in acquiring the business. We also found that some key employees had discussed it between themselves, and they were also interested in acquiring the business. And this is, again, I guess, another good thing, bad thing kind of decision point. although it's not our decision to make at this point in time as to whether we let those employees acquire the business, you have to be honest to them and tell them what it's really like. And so we didn't want to not have them continue on with the business, but we needed to make sure that they weren't going to end up in a place that they couldn't support anyway. So on the longer terms, they decided to not continue with that project, and in around October, November 2021, it was all but done that the business would be liquidated, the assets sold off, things like intellectual property, websites. We had, I don't know, 100 or so domain names that the company had bought over the years. Some of them were worth quite a bit of money. We had a lot of equipment, obviously, that was in our office. And there were other, pieces of intellectual property and other assets that had to be dealt with. We had a rental office, so that wasn't an issue. We just terminated the rent agreement there. And most things worked out very well. In fact, the majority of issues that you might have worked out very well for us. The biggest struggle, to be truthful, was the paperwork. It was a monumental effort, and thankfully we had fantastic business systems, and we took advantage of the fact that we had a lot of information already recorded electronically. And when we looked at the documentation that had to be completed, of course, it was all in document format. But again, Brian Palmer came forward and said, if we put all this information into the right spreadsheets and the right formats, and we do it all digitally, and it took away probably weeks of work, effectively, to get that done. But it was still a big job. And so at that point in time, really we knew exactly where we were. We had pretty much settled up with everyone, all the stakeholders. Some were good, some were bad. So like all things, not everyone's going to see it the same way. Of the 1,000 or so customers we had 2 or 3 that really gave us a hard time, frankly. But the rest had all the emotions attached. Some of them had been with the company for 18 years or so, and they hated the fact that we were going to go. But there was not much we could do about that. And also the employees, again, some of them was a difficult conversation, but most really understood where we were and what we were trying to do. And at the end of the day, all the employees came out with all their entitlements the way they should have got them. From a shareholder point of view, obviously the shares were not really worth anything at that point. They had loaned money to the company. That loan is yet to be completely determined as to how it will be finalised, depending on what's final after the end of the liquidation process. But it looks like that most of those loan monies will probably not be repaid. But that's part and parcel of making an investment in a business, to be frank. So at the end of the day, we, I think, got out of the business processes in the right way for everyone concerned. Part of that process obviously was helping the customers. We did have to spend time helping customers transition websites from one place to another. Luckily, again, there were a couple of employees who were willing to assist in that space, and we spent a lot of time just walking through not any negative issues with those customers, but just helping them take data from one place and moving it to another place so that they could continue their businesses without interruption. And that actually occurred for all the people that we were involved with, all the customers we were involved with at that time. all of them were able to continue their business. They had very little disruption, and I think many of them were very happy that we helped them through that process. So where are we at today? If you look back, we started this whole process in 2021. We're now in 2023. It's been almost 2 years. We're still waiting on absolutely the finalisation back from all the ATO and the people that be to wrap up the business. All the paperwork, everything's done. There's no loose ends. But there is a process to follow. Australia doesn't make it overly difficult to stop a business at some point in time, but there are processes that have to be followed, and there are legal issues. In Australia, for example, we have ABNs, and we have to get notice that those ABNs are going to be discontinued, and the company is discontinued. All those things, happen as a part of what we did. The very emotional part is really knowing that the business is gone after. Now it has been 20 years since we started the business, and the business is gone. We still have people contact us about eCorner, so it's probably something that's going to still go on for a little while yet. The shareholders in the company. We had many different shareholders who had acquired parts of the company or shares in the company during the life of the company. Some were employees, some were people that had worked with the organisation as we grew. There were people in my own family who were shareholders. And working with those people, there were also a gamut of things that we had to do. And not all of those shareholders, unfortunately, were entirely happy with the process. It was at the end of the day, it is a shock to everybody, and everyone takes those shocks different ways. Some of the people working in the company had a little bit of time to absorb what was happening, but some of the initial conversations with shareholders to tell them that the shareholding was no longer going to be worth anything, and we were going to wrap up the company, and in fact to invite them to that shareholder meeting where we were going to make that, agree to that process. There were some people who initially were very angry, but there's nothing really you can do to appease that. It's not really personal anger. It's an anger of more the fact that they couldn't do anything about the process, I guess. So that's just something you have to work through. Again, JHK Legal and O'Brien Palmer were fantastic in helping us deal with those issues and explaining to us, and also sometimes to the shareholders and the employees, just what the processes were. So we had a number of, for example, conference calls. It was in the middle of COVID, remember it still. We had a number of virtual calls with the employees, with O'Brien Palmer people, so they could just ask questions directly, just talk to them and answer their questions and explain what was going to happen. It's good to go through and make sure everyone that is involved has exhausted the questions they want to ask, because it's those unanswered questions that eventually may disturb you more than anything else. At the end of the day, there were a number of things that we learned that I think contributed to the fact that it went as smoothly as it could. I'm not going to say it was perfect, but it went as smoothly as it could. And the first one, I guess, was the fact that we were actually surrounded by pretty good people. O'Brien Palmer, as I mentioned, JHK Legal, Groves and Partners, Presidio, they all provided great support for us. And some of it was we paid for. Don't get me wrong. I mean, you don't there's anything for nothing. But they did go sometimes to great lengths to make sure that we had the information or the support we needed. We also had a realistic plan for the business. I know it sounds a strange thing to say, but if you wind the clock back to 2018, we actually did a business plan when we knew we had to reshape and change the business in order to go forward. And one of the options in that business plan was to liquidate the business. So we knew back in 2018 that we didn't expect it to happen, but we knew that one option that we might have to confront was a business liquidation with the way things were and moving forward. So the business plan is really important, and a lot of people just don't ever consider the negative options in a business plan, because negative options do become real sometimes, whether you want them to or not. The fact that we'd been with the same accountants, Presidio, for almost 18 years was perfect. They knew the business as well as we did. And they agreed with our 2018 plan that we had these options to go through, and one of them was a liquidation. The one thing that pushed us to the point of making that decision to liquidate was cash flow. So, every month we would collect money from our customers, but during COVID, those money collections became more difficult in some cases, and we had some businesses closed. So about 15 to 20% of our customers failed to get through the COVID process, because they were not just online businesses. They also had physical presences, physical shops, shops on the high street, or small business shops or factories or whatever it might be. And those companies found it very hard to get through COVID. And so as everyone has probably already heard, there were a lot of businesses that went out of business because of that face-to-face activity no longer being able to exist. We also been keeping financially up to date, and by that I mean a lot of businesses, when they start to struggle financially, will rob Peter to pay Paul, and so they might move their BAS from a monthly to a quarterly BAS, or they might defer ATO payments, or they might defer superannuation payments. We didn't do any of those things, so we were making regular monthly superannuation contributions, we were making regular BAS contributions. So when we look at the financials, they were fundamentally pretty well up to date up until that last month. Tracking leave entitlement for staff, we didn't think of. Because you don't really think. I mean, you know that someone's been there for a long time, but the fact is that once you get past 10 years, the long service leave entitlements kick in, and they can be pretty onerous. So we had some staff who had leave entitlements who were in the range of $100,000, and those entitlements have to be paid out. But that's where Fed came in and took care of some of those things, and that's true for most small businesses. That will happen. We went out and sought help early, which was important. And the last thing, I guess, is really important, is we had great company data. So all through our existence, we had kept records, and we had information regarding companies, customers, suppliers, staff, all online, all available, all easily used and passed on, whereas many companies just don't have those records. So at the end of the day, that's where we got to. But I think the core thing is to have people you trust that actually help you, and that's really one of the things we learned. So what can I pass on to people that are going through a similar thought process? If you're thinking that you might be struggling and not be able to get the business to carry on effectively. If you're running up debts and having to go and borrow lots of money. And don't laugh when I say that there are companies out there who live on credit cards. We had some customers that we worked with prior to obviously stopping the business who had 10 or 12 credit cards, and their way of paying debts was to just cycle through credit cards. And it's a terrible way to run a business, right? So if you're starting to get these things, seeing these things in your business that worry you about it financially, then seek advice. I think O'Brien Palmer turned out for us to be the perfect organisation to work with, because they were, number one, all the other people we trusted knew them, and that was, again, it sounds bizarre, but it was coincidental. We didn't start out by going and getting all these people to say, and who would you suggest? It's not the way it worked. So that worked out very well. I'm not saying it's going to work the same for everyone, but O'Brien Palmer gave us a very good understanding of what we had to do, and they helped us through that process. They put a team in place, a few of their people who were the go-to people that we could go and ask questions of almost any time of the day or night. Luckily, we didn't have to go there many times during the night. And they gave us good, solid advice. In some cases, they just took over the problem for us, because it wasn't, as I say, once you've gone into that process, many of these things aren't your problem anymore. It's actually the liquidator who is now running your business. And so, if someone comes along and starts to hassle you over a debt or whatever it might be, then those things are things that you can pass on to someone else to handle. And there are ways that they can be handled. So Brian Palmer were great. I'd thoroughly recommend them. The end result for most people after they've liquidated the business is generally a period, I think this is the way it goes, is generally a period where they feel that they've let a lot of people down. But what I think is very much important to understand, that if you don't do something, you're going to let many more people down over a much longer term than by actually taking action and doing something with business. The one thing you've got to remember in an organisation is not four walls and a couple of computers. It's people. And so at the end of the day, we have to look at where all those people are, what they were doing. Did they all come out relatively well or relatively badly? Luckily, as I mentioned earlier, the customers mostly came out well. The staff pretty much all came out well. They all have jobs. They all went on to different roles and different careers, which is good. They keep in touch, which is great. Our suppliers are our suppliers. They will go on to the next thing they do. That's just the way it works. So we had many shareholders. Most of them were friends who we'd known over a long period of time. And they all, at the end of the day, continued to do the things they did, right? They all had other interests in other businesses, and so there was no massive problem there. Personally, I've moved on. I still have a lot of knowledge and background in the e-commerce, and strangely, people still trust me. Silly thing to say, maybe. But I have had customers, existing or past customers, ask for help, and so I've been doing some work with some businesses to help them in their e-commerce plans and management. I do a lot of not-for-profit work now, so I volunteer in a couple of large not-for-profit organisations, and I help them manage their businesses and try and raise some money. I think we overall did a very good thing, and that is in the 18, 19 years that we were in operation. If we look back on it and do the numbers, there were over 5,000 small businesses who started their e-commerce life with eCorner, and most of those businesses are still running, and some of them now are very large businesses. And so that's something we did, which I think will always still exist.
Thanks very much, John. I'm sure that everyone watching this could take a lot from what you've had to say today. Your story is pretty inspiring, and so is the generosity that you've shown in sharing your story with everybody. If John's story resonates with you, if there's anything that you can take from that, why don't you give us a call today? We're happy to take the time to sit with you on a no-fee, no-obligation basis and talk about the circumstances of your business and the options that are available to you.
You're getting really used to this.
I'm quite calm about it now.
Yeah.
Nope, I don't like that. So I'm looking right at the camera.
Camera, not me. I'll put this.
All right.
In 2003, it's been...
Go back to 2023.
Oh, 2000, sorry. Yeah. We're in 2023. Do you want me to start that again?
Yeah. That's your first clip of the whole thing. That's awesome.
So...